In 2021, Florida dropped 15 million seed bombs from helicopters across 300,000 acres of damaged wetlands. Environmental groups said it wouldn't work. Scientists said aerial seeding was too imprecise. Agriculture experts said the seeds would just wash away in the first storm. 3 years later, the results are so successful that NASA is now photographing the area from space to study what happened. What grew there is rewriting the rules of ecological restoration. Here's what they dropped, why it worked, when every expert said it wouldn't, and why this might be the solution to restoring destroyed ecosystems faster than anyone thought possible. Before we talk about what grew, you need to understand what seed bombs actually are, because they're not what you're imagining. These aren't grenades filled with seeds. They're small clay balls containing seeds, nutrients, and protective coating designed to survive impact from 500 feet up. Here's how they work. Native plant seeds are mixed with clay, compost, and sometimes activated charcoal. The mixture is rolled into marble-sized balls and dried. The clay protects seeds from birds, insects, and weather until conditions are right for germination. When it rains, the clay dissolves gradually, releasing seeds along with nutrients that help them establish. The technique was actually developed in ancient Japan for reseeding hillsides after forest fires. Modern environmentalists rediscovered it in the 1970s, but it was considered fringe science. Nobody thought it would work at scale. Florida was about to prove everyone wrong. But here's why Florida even needed this. Followed by Hurricane Michael in 2018. Between them, they destroyed over 300,000 acres of wetlands across central and northern Florida. Storm surge flooded areas with salt water, killing freshwater vegetation. Wind stripped mature trees. Erosion washed away topsoil. What remained looked like a lunar landscape. Traditional restoration would require planting individual seedlings by hand. It would take 40 years and cost $800 million. Florida didn't have 40 years or $800 million. They needed something faster, cheaper, and crazy enough that it might actually work. Florida didn't just throw random seeds out of helicopters. They selected 32 native species specifically chosen to create cascading ecological effects. This wasn't gardening. This was ecosystem engineering. The foundation species were wetland grasses, Spartina patens, also called salt meadow hay, Juncus romarianus, black needle rush. These species can tolerate both fresh and brackish water, survive flooding, and establish in poor soil. More importantly, their root systems stabilize soil and create habitat for other species. But here's the genius part. Mixed with the grasses were flowering plants that attract pollinators. Helianthus debilis, beach sunflowers, Salvia lyrata, lyrave sage, Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susans. These species don't just look pretty, they create food sources for insects, which attract birds, which disperse more seeds, which accelerate ecosystem recovery. Then came the nitrogen fixers, Chamacrista fasciculata, partridge pea, Baptisia species. These plants form relationships with soil bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms other plants can use. They're essentially fertilizer factories that improve soil quality while growing. The final layer was shrubs and small trees. Wax myrtle, Wax martatoria, Yaupon holly, Baccharis halamifolia, saltbush. These provide structure, shade, and habitat for larger animals. But they were included in smaller quantities because the grasses needed to establish first. The seed bombs contained all 32 species mixed together. When they hit the ground, they created instant biodiversity. Traditional restoration plants one species at a time. That's 1,000 to 1,500 seeds per acre of 32 different species. The diversity was intentional. Not every species would survive in every location, but something would grow everywhere. But here's what made scientists skeptical. Traditional seeding has maybe 15 to 20% germination rates. Of those, maybe half survive to maturity. Scientists calculated that Florida's approach would result in 7 to 10% establishment rate at best. They called it wasteful, imprecise, and unlikely to succeed. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission proceeded anyway. The entire operation cost $12 million. That's $40 per acre compared to $2,600 per acre for traditional hand planting. Even if success rates were lower, the cost savings were enormous. And they had a secret advantage that scientists didn't account for. By September 2021, 5 months after the drop, initial surveys showed germination across 87% of the target area. Not establishment, not mature growth, just germination. Seeds had sprouted successfully in nearly 9 out of 10 locations. Scientists expected maybe 4 out of 10. The germination wasn't random. Seeds germinated preferentially in microsites where conditions were ideal. Clay balls had rolled into depressions where water collected. Others lodged in existing vegetation that provided shade. The imprecision of aerial dropping wasn't a bug. It was a feature. Seeds ended up in locations humans couldn't have predicted, but which turned out to be perfect. The wetland grasses established first. Spartina and Juncus created dense mats across thousands of acres. Their roots stabilized soil that had been eroding since the hurricanes. By December 2021, areas that had been bare mud 8 months earlier were covered in grass 2 feet tall. Then the flowering plants emerged. Beach sunflowers bloomed in January 2022, creating acres of yellow flowers visible from aerial surveys. Black-eyed Susans followed in March. Salvia in April. The blooming sequence provided continuous nectar sources for pollinators across 6 months. By year 1, establishment rates were 34%, more than triple what scientists predicted. For every 3 seed bombs dropped, 1 plant survived to maturity. At scale, that's 5 million established plants across 300,000 acres. Traditional methods would have planted maybe 200,000 seedlings in the same time frame. Something unexpected happened in year 2. The ecosystem started accelerating its own recovery faster than the seeds could account for. This is where it gets mind-blowing. The established grasses created habitat for seed-dispersing birds. Red-winged blackbirds, boat-tailed grackles, and marsh wrens moved into the new vegetation. These birds eat seeds from existing plants and defecate them across the area. They were spreading species that weren't in the original seed bombs. Natural recruitment started supplementing the artificial seeding, but here's the cascade effect. The flowering plants attracted pollinators. Pollinators attracted insectivorous birds. Insectivorous birds nested in the shrubs. Birds attracted small mammals. Small mammals dispersed more seeds. The nitrogen-fixing plants transformed the soil. Initial soil tests in 2021 showed nitrogen levels barely above 0. By 2023, nitrogen levels in areas with established partridge pea were comparable to undisturbed wetlands. The bacteria living on plant roots were generating nitrogen from the atmosphere and depositing it in soil. Free fertilizer that enabled other species to establish. Unexpected species started appearing. Sawgrass that wasn't in the seed bombs showed up in year 2. Elderberry bushes appeared. Willow trees germinated in wet areas, waiting for conditions to improve. The seed bombs created those conditions, and the dormant seeds woke up. By the end of year 2, species diversity exceeded the 32 species in the original bombs. The ecosystem was now self-sustaining and recruiting species without further human intervention. In 2024, wildlife cameras placed across the restoration area documented something extraordinary. Large animals were returning to ecosystems that hadn't supported them since the hurricanes 7 years earlier. White-tailed deer appeared first. Herds of 10 to 15 deer were photographed grazing on established vegetation. Deer had avoided the area since 2018 because there was nothing to eat. Now there were acres of grasses, forbs, and shrubs. The food source brought them back. Wading birds followed. Great blue herons, white ibises, roseate spoonbills. These species require specific habitat, shallow water with vegetation and abundant small fish or invertebrates. The restored wetlands provided exactly that. By spring 2024, breeding pairs were nesting in areas that had been barren 3 years earlier. But here's the big one. Florida panthers. Trail cameras caught 3 separate panthers moving through the restoration area. Panthers are critically endangered, with only 120 to 230 individuals remaining in Florida. They require large territories with adequate prey populations. The fact that they're using restored habitat means the ecosystem has recovered enough to support top predators. Alligators moved in. This might not sound impressive because alligators are everywhere in Florida, but they're actually habitat specialists. They need specific combinations of water depth, vegetation density, and prey availability. Alligators returning indicates the wetland hydrology has recovered to functional levels. The trophic cascade was complete. Seeds dropped from helicopters in 2021 created vegetation that fed insects. Insects fed birds. Birds fed mammals. Mammals and birds supported predators. Within 3 years, the restored area went from ecological desert to functioning ecosystem with all trophic levels present. Here's what scientists are now realizing. Hand-planted restoration creates artificial uniformity. Humans plant seedlings in rows, at consistent spacing, with single species in designated areas. This looks organized, but doesn't replicate natural patterns. Random and diverse. Seed bombs create natural-looking chaos. They land randomly. They contain multiple species. They end up in microsites that human planters would never choose but which turn out to be ideal. The randomness isn't inefficiency, it's mimicking natural seed dispersal that evolution optimized over millions of years. But here's the deeper advantage. Hand planting is expensive because it requires human labor. Labor costs scale linearly. To restore twice the area requires twice the workers. Aerial seeding scales logarithmically. One helicopter can drop seeds across massive areas. The cost per acre drops dramatically at scale. The failure rate is actually beneficial. When 66% of seeds don't establish, that's not waste. Those seeds become food for birds, insects, and small mammals. They contribute nutrients to soil as they decompose. The seeds that survive are by definition the ones best adapted to local conditions. Natural selection happens automatically. Traditional restoration fights nature, planting individual seedlings, watering them, protecting them from herbivores, replanting failures. It's constant maintenance. Seed bombing works with nature. Drop seeds everywhere. The ones that land in good spots survive. The ones that don't become food or compost. In January 2024, NASA began using satellite imagery to track the Florida restoration. They're not just documenting success. They're studying whether this technique can be scaled globally to restore damaged ecosystems everywhere. The satellite data shows something remarkable. The restored areas now have vegetation density and albedo measurements nearly identical to undisturbed wetlands. From space, you can't tell the difference between restored areas and wetlands that were never damaged. The recovery is that complete. But here's what NASA is really interested in. Carbon sequestration. Wetlands absorb massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in soil and plant matter. The 300,000 acres of restored Florida wetlands are now sequestering an estimated 75,000 tons of CO2 per year. That's equivalent to taking 16,000 cars off the road permanently. If this technique works at scale globally, the implications are massive. There are 170 million acres of degraded wetlands worldwide. If even 20% could be restored using seed bombing, that's 34 million acres, sequestering 8.5 million tons of CO2 annually. All for a fraction of the cost of traditional restoration. NASA is now sharing Florida's data with Australia, which is considering seed bombing to restore areas damaged by the 2019 to 2020 bushfires. Brazil is interested in using it for Amazon rainforest restoration. Kenya is exploring it for savanna rehabilitation after drought. Here's what the experts missed. They evaluated seed bombing using standards designed for agricultural crops. Agriculture requires high germination rates, uniform growth, and single-species dominance. Ecosystem restoration requires the opposite. Low germination is fine if what survives creates functional habitat. Random distribution is fine if it mimics natural patterns. Species diversity is more important than density. But here's the deeper lesson. Sometimes cheap and imprecise beats expensive and precise. Hand planting is precise, but slow and costly. Seed bombing is imprecise, but fast and cheap. At ecosystem scales, speed and cost matter more than precision. You can afford to fail 66% of the time if success is 20 times cheaper. The success also reveals something about ecological resilience. These ecosystems didn't need perfect conditions to recover. They needed a starting point. The seed bombs provided that starting point, and nature handled the rest. The seeds that worked recruited more seeds. The plants that established attracted animals that dispersed more plants. The initial intervention catalyzed self-sustaining recovery. Scientists were thinking about restoration as something humans do to nature. The seed bombs proved that restoration is something humans can start, and nature will finish. You don't need to micromanage every detail. You need to create conditions where natural processes can resume. Florida proved that seed bombing works at scale for wetland restoration. But the technique isn't limited to wetlands. It can work anywhere humans have destroyed ecosystems and need to rebuild them quickly and cheaply. Deforested areas. Drop tree seeds mixed with nitrogen-fixing shrubs. The shrubs establish first, improve soil, and create shade. Trees germinate in improved conditions. Abandoned mines. Seeds mixed with biochar and mycorrhizal fungi to remediate contaminated soil while establishing vegetation. Desertified grasslands. Native grass seeds with water retention gel to improve germination in arid conditions. Post-fire landscapes. Fire-adapted species that germinate in response to smoke and heat. Dropped immediately after fires while ash still provides nutrients. The principle is universal. Identify native species suited to the damaged area. Mix seeds with protective coating and growth enhancers. Drop them from aircraft. Let nature sort out what grows where. Accept that most will fail, but enough will succeed to catalyze ecosystem recovery. The cost savings make restoration possible at scales that were previously unthinkable. At $40 per acre, you can restore 100,000 acres for $4 million. Traditional methods would cost $260 million for the same area. That 98% cost reduction transforms restoration from a limited demonstration project into something that can be deployed globally. Florida didn't just restore 300,000 acres of wetlands. They proved that humans can repair ecological damage at the same scale and speed that humans create ecological damage. For decades, we've been good at destroying ecosystems and terrible at rebuilding them. Seed bombing might have finally balanced that equation. What grew in those Florida wetlands wasn't just 32 species of plants. It was proof that nature is more resilient than we thought. That cheap solutions sometimes work better than expensive ones, and that 15 million seed bombs dropped from helicopters can rebuild entire ecosystems in 3 years. That's not just mind-blowing, that's a roadmap for planetary ecological recovery.